sunrise over the edge of the world. First, everything was gray and still. The sky was gray, the grass was gray with dew, the light was gray, and the wind held its breath. Then sharp streaks of green came into the eastern sky. If there was a little cloud, it turned pink. Laura and Mary sat on the damp, cold rocks, hugging their chilly legs. They rested their chins on their knees and watched. And in the grass below them, Jack sat, watching too, but they never could see when the sky first began to be pink. The sky was very faintly pink, then it was pinker. The color went higher up the sky. It grew brighter and deeper. It blazed like fire, and suddenly the little cloud was glittering gold. In the center of the blazing color, on the flat edge of the earth, a tiny silver sun appeared. It was a short streak of white fire. Suddenly the whole sun bounded up, round and huge, far bigger than the ordinary sun, and throbbing with so much light that its roundness almost burst. Laura couldn't help blinking. While she blinked just once, the sky turned blue, the golden cloud vanished. The everyday sun shone prairie grasses where thousands of birds were flying, glittering. In the evenings, when the cattle came home, Laura and Mary always ran fast to get up on the big rock where all those herds and horns and trampling legs reached them. Pa was working for Mr. Nelson now, and Pete and Bright had no work to do. They went with Spot and the other cows to eat grass. Laura's never afraid of gentle white Spot, but Pete and Bright were so big that they would scare anybody. One evening, all the cattle were angry. They came bellowing and pawing, and when they reached the big rock, they did not go by. They ran around it, bawling and fighting. Their eyes rolled, their horns tossed and slashed at each other. Their hoofs raised a smudge of dust, and their clashing horns were frightful. Mary was so scared that she could not move. Laura was so scared that she jumped right off the rock. She knew she had to drive Spot and Pete and Bright into the stable. The cattle towered up in the dust. Their feet trampled and their horns slashed and they bawled. But Johnny helped to head Pete and Bright and Spot toward the stable. Jack helped too. Jack growled at their heels and Laura ran yelling behind them. And with his big stick, Johnny drove the herd away. Spot went into the stable. Then Bright went in, he was going in, and Laura was not scared now, when suddenly Big Pete wheeled around. His horns looked hooked, and his tail stood up, and he galloped after the herd. Laura ran in front of him. She waved her arms and yelled. He bellowed and went wandering, thundering toward the creek bank. Laura ran with all her might to get in front of him again, but her legs were short and Pete's were long. Jack came running as fast as he could, but he only made Pete jump longer jumps. Pete jumped right on top of the dugout. Laura saw his hind leg go down through the roof. She saw him sit on it. That big ox was going to fall on Ma and Carrie, and it was Laura's fault because she had not stopped him. He heaved and pulled his leg up. Laura had not stopped running. She was in front of Pete now, and Jack was in front of him too. They chased Pete into the stable, and Laura put up the bars. She was shaking all over, and her legs were weak. Her knees kept hitting together. Ma come running up the path carrying Carrie, but no harm had been done. There was only a hole through the roof where Pete's leg had come down and gone up again.
Ma said it had given her a turn to see it coming down through the ceiling. But there's no great damage done, she said. She stuffed the hole full of grass and swept out the earth that had fallen into the dugout. Then she and Laura laughed because it was so funny to live in a house where a stair could step through the roof. It was like being rabbits. Next morning, while Laura was doing the dishes, she saw some little dark things rolling down the whitewashed wall. They were crumbs of earth. She looked up to see where they had come from, and she jumped away from there quicker than a rabbit. A big rock smashed down, and the whole ceiling poured down over it. The sun shone down into the house, and the air was full of dust. Ma and Mary and Laura choked and sneezed, looking up at the sky where the ceiling should have been. Carrie sat sneezing in Ma's arms. Jack rushed in, and when he saw the sky overhead, he growled at it. Then he sneezed. Well,
settles it, said Ma. What does, Ma? Laura asked. She thought Ma meant something was settling to dust. This does, Ma said. Pa will have to mend that roof tomorrow. Then they carried out the rock and the earth and the bunches of hay, that had fallen. Ma swept and swept again with a willow twig broom. That night they slept in their house, under the starry sky. Such a thing had never happened before. Next day, Pa had to stay at home to build a new roof. Laura helped him carry fresh willow boughs, and she handed them to him while he wedged them into place. They put clean grass thick over the willows. They piled earth on the grass. Then, over the top, Pa laid strips of sod cut from the prairie. He fitted them together, and Laura helped him stamp them down. That grass will never know it's been moved, Pa said. In a few days, you won't be able to tell this new roof from the prairie. He did not scold Laura for letting Pete get away. He only said, no place for a big ox to be running right over our roof. Straw stack. When Mr. Nelson's harvesting was done, Pa paid for Spot. He could do his own harvesting now. He sharpened the long, dangerous guides that little girls must never touch, and he cut down the wheat in a small field beyond the stable. He bound it in bundles and stacked them. Then, every morning, he went to work on the level land across the creek. He cut the prairie grass and left it to dry in the sunshine. He raked it into piles with a wooden rake. He yoked Pete and Bryce to the wagon, and he hauled the hay and made 6 big stacks of it over there. At night, he was always too tired now to play the fiddle, but he was glad because when the hay was stacked, he could plow that stubble land, and that would be the wheat field. One morning at daylight, 3 strange men came with a threshing machine. They threshed Pa's stack of wheat. Laura heard the harsh machinery noises while she drove Spot through the dewy grass, and when the sun rose, chaff flew golden in the wind. The threshing was done, and the men went away with the machine before breakfast. Pa said he wished Hanston had sown more wheat. There's enough to make us sunflowers, he said, and the straw with what hay I've cut will feed the stock through the winter. Next year, he said, we'll have a crock of wheat that will amount to something. When Laura and Mary went up on the prairie to play that morning, the first thing they saw was a beautiful golden straw stack. It was tall and shining bright in the sunshine. It smelled sweeter than hay. Laura's feet slid in the sliding, slippery straw, but she could climb faster than straw slid. In a minute, she was high on top of the stack. She looked across the willow tops and away beyond the creek at the far end. She could see the whole great round prairie. She was high up in the sky, almost as high as birds. Palms waved, her feet bounced on the springy straw. She was almost flying, way high up in the windy sky. I'm flying, she called down to Mary. Mary climbed up to her. Jump, jump, Laura said. They held hands and jumped, round and round, higher and higher. The wind blew and their skirts flapped, and their sunbonnets swung at the end of the sunbonnets changed around the neck. Higher, higher, Laura sang, jumping. Suddenly the straw slid under her. Over the edge of the stack she went, sitting in straw, sliding faster and faster. Bump! She landed at the plump. Mary landed on her. They rolled and laughed in the cracking straw. Then they climbed the stack and slid down again. They had never had so much fun.
They climbed up and slid, until there was hardly any stack left in the middle of the loose heaps of straw. Then they were sober. Pa had made that straw stack, and now it was not at all as he had left it. Laura looked at Mary, and Mary looked at her, and they looked at what was left of that straw stack. Then Mary said she was going into the dugout, and Laura went quietly with her. They were very good, helping Ma and playing nicely with Carrie until Pa came to dinner. When he came in, go ahead.
Looked straight at Laura, and Laura looked at the floor. You girls mustn't slide down the straw stack anymore, Pa said. I had to stop and pitch up all that loose straw. We won't, Pa, Laura said earnestly, and Mary said, no, Pa, we won't. After dinner, Mary washed the dishes, and Laura dried them. Then they put on their sunbonnets and went up the path to the prairie. The straw stack was golden bright in the sunshine. Laura, what are you doing? Said Mary. I'm not doing anything, said Laura. I'm not even hardly touching it. You come right away from there, or I'll tell Ma, said Mary. Pa didn't say I couldn't smell it, said Laura. She stood close to the golden stack and sniffed long, deep sniffs. The straw was warmed by the sun. It smelled better than wheat kernels taste when you chew them. Laura burned her face and shutting her eyes and smelling deeper and deeper. She said. Mary came and smelled the scent. Laura looked up at the glistening, prickly golden stack. She had never seen the sky so blue as it was above that gold. She could not stay on the ground. she had to be higher than that blue sky. Laura, Mary cried. Pa said we mustn't. Laura was climbing. He did not either, she contradicted. He did not say we must not climb up it. He said we must not slide down it. I'm only climbing. You come right straight down from there, said Mary. Laura was on top of the stack. She looked down at Mary and said, like a very good little girl, I'm not going to slide down. Pa said not to. Nothing but the blue sky was higher than she was. The wind was blowing. The green prairie was wide and far. Laura spread her arms and jumped, and the straw bounded her high. I'm flying, she sang. Mary climbed up, and Mary began to fly too. They bounced until they could bounce no higher. Then they flopped flat on the sweet, warm straw. Boulders of straw rose up on both sides of Mary. She rolled into the bulge and it sank, but another rose up. She rolled onto that bulge, and then she was rolling faster and faster. She could not stop. Laura, Mary screamed. Pa said. But Laura was rolling over, right down that straw stack. She rolled and thumped in straw on the ground. She jumped up and climbed that straw stack again as fast as she could. She flopped and began to roll again. Come on, Mary, she shouted. Pa didn't say we can't roll. Mary stayed on top of the stack and argued. I know Pa didn't say we can't roll, but, well then, Laura rolled down again. Come on, she called up. It's lots of fun. Well, but said Mary. Then she came rolling down. It was great fun. It was more fun than sliding. They climbed and rolled and climbed and rolled, laughing harder all the time. More and more straw rolled down with them.
They waded in and rolled each other in it, and climbed and rolled down again.
There was hardly anything left to climb. Then they brushed every bit of straw off their dresses. They picked up every bit out of their hair, and they went quietly into the dugout. When Pa came from the hayfield that night, Mary was busily setting the table for supper. Laura was behind the door, busy with the box of paper dolls. Laura, Pa said dreadfully, come here. Slowly Laura went out from behind the door. Come here, said Pa, right over here by Mary. He sat down and he stood them before him, side by side. But it was Laura he looked at, said sternly, you girls have been sliding down the straw stack again. No, Pa, said Laura. Mary, said Pa, did you slide down the straw stack? No, Pa, Mary said. Laura, Pa's voice was terrible. Tell me again, did you slide down the straw stack? No, Pa, Laura answered again. She looked straight into Pa's shocked eyes. She did not know why he looked like that. Laura, Pa said. We did not slide, Pa, Laura exclaimed, but we did roll down it. Pa got up quickly and went to the door and stood looking out. His back quivered. Laura and Mary did not know what to think. When Pa turned around, his face was stern, but his eyes were twinkling. All right, Laura, he said, but now I want you girls to stay away from that straw stack. Pete and Brian Straw will have nothing but hay and straw to eat this winter. They need every bite of it. You don't want them to be hungry, do you? Oh, no, Pa, they said. Well, that straw's to be 50 feet them. It must stay stacked. Do you understand? Yes, Pa, said Laura and Mary. That was the end of their playing on the straw stack. Grasshopper weather. Now plums were ripening in the wild plum thickets all along Plum Creek. Plum trees were low trees. They grew close together with many little scraggly branches all strung with thin-skinned, juicy plums. Around them the air was sweet and sleepy, and wings hummed. Pa was plowing all the land across the creek, where he had cut the hay. Early before the sun came up, when Laura went to dry Spot to meet the cattle at the gray boulder, Pete and Brian were gone from the stable. Pa yoked them to the plow and gone to work. When Laura and Mary had washed the breakfast dishes, they took tin pails and went to pick plums. From the top of their house, they could see Pa plowing. The oxen and the plow and Pa crawled slowly along a curve of the prairie. They looked very small, and a little smoke of dust blew away from the plow. Every day, the velvety brown dark patch of plow land grew bigger. It ate up the silver gold stubble field beyond the haystacks. It spread over the prairie waves. It was going to be a very big wheat field, and when someday Pa cut the wheat, he and Ma, Laura, and Mary would have everything they could think of. They would have a house and horses and candy every day. When Pa made a wheat crop, Laura went wading through the tall grasses to the plum thickets by the creek. Her sunbonnet hung down her back, and she swung her tin pail. The grasses were crisping yellow now, and dozens of little grasshoppers jumped crackling away from Laura's swishing feet. Mary came walking behind in the path Laura made, and she kept her sunbonnet on. When they came to a plum thicket, they set down their big pails. They filled their little pails with plums and emptied them into the big pails till they were full. Then they carried the big pails back to the roof of the dugout. On the clean grass, Ma spread clean cloths, and Laura and Mary laid the plums on the cloths to dry in the sun. Next winter, they would have dried plums to eat. The shade of the plum thickets was a thin shade. Sunshine flickered between the narrow leaves overhead. The little branches sagged with their weight of plums, and plums had fallen and rolled together between drifts of long grass underfoot. Some were smashed, some were smooth and perfect, and some had cracked open, showing the juicy yellow inside. Bees and hornets stood thick along the cracks, sucking up the juices with all their might. Their scaly tails wiggled with joy. They were too busy and too heavy to sting. When Laura poked in with a blade of grass, they only moved a step and did not stop sucking up the good plum juice. Laura put all the good plums in her pail, but she flicked the hornets off the cracked plums with her fingernail and quickly popped the plum into her mouth. It was sweet and warm and juicy. The hornets buzzed around her in dismay. They did not know what had become of their plum, but in a minute they pushed into the crowd, sucking at another one. "I declare you eat more plums than you pick up," Mary said. "I don't either any such a thing," Laura contradicted. "I pick up every plum I eat." "You know very well what I mean," Mary said crossly. "You just play around while I work." But Laura filled her big pail as quickly as Mary filled hers. Mary was cross because she would rather sew or read than pick plums. But Laura hated to sit still. She liked picking plums. She liked to shake the trees. You must know exactly how to shake a plum tree. If you shake it too hard, the green plums fall, and that wastes them. Shake it too softly, you not get all the ripe plums. In the night they will fall, and some will smash and be wasted. Laura learned exactly how to shake a plum tree. She held a scaly rough bowl and shook it. One quick, gentle shake. Every plum swung on its stem, and all around her they fell, pattering. Then one more jerk while the plums were swinging, and the last ripe ones fell plump, 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 plump. There were many kinds of plums. When the red ones were all picked, the yellow ones were ripe, then the blue ones. The largest of all were the very last. They were the frost plums that would not ripen until after frost. One morning the whole world was delicately silver. Every blade of grass was silvery in the path of the thin sheen. It was hot like fire under Laura's bare feet, and they left dark footprints in it. The air was cold on her nose, and her breath steamed. So did spots. When the sun came up, the whole prairie sparkled. Millions of tiny, tiny sparks of color blazed on the grasses. That day the frost plums were ripe. They were large purple plums, and all over the purple was a silvery thin sheen like frost. The sun was not so hot now, and the nights were chilly. The prairie was almost the tawny color of the haystacks. The smell of the air was different, and the sky was not so sharply blue. Still, the sunshine was warm at noon. There was no rain and no more frost. It was almost Thanksgiving time, and there was no snow. "I don't know what to make of it," Pa said. "I never saw weather like this. Nelson says the old timers call it grasshopper weather." "Whatever do they mean by that, Ma?" asked him. Pa shook his head. "You can't prove it by me. Grasshopper weather was what Nelson said. I can't make out what he meant by it." "Likely some old Norwegian saying," Ma said. Laura liked the sound of the words, and when she ran through the crackling prairie grasses and saw the grasshoppers jumping, she sang to herself, "Grasshopper weather, grasshopper weather." Cattle in the hay. Summer was gone, winter was coming, and now it was time for Pa to make a trip to town. Here in Minnesota, town was so near that Pa would be only gone only one day, and Ma was going with him. She took Carrie because Carrie was too little to be left far from Ma. But Mary and Laura were big girls. Mary was going on 9, and Laura was going on 8, and they could stay at home and take care of everything while Pa and Ma were gone. Before going to town, Ma made a new dress for Carrie from the pink calico that Laura had worn when she was little. There was enough of it to make Carrie a little pink sunbonnet. Carrie's hair had been in curl papers all night. It hung in long, golden, round curls, and when Ma tied the pink sunbonnet strings under Carrie's chin, Carrie looked like a rose. Ma wore her hoop skirts and her best dress, the beautiful toque with little strawberries on it that she had worn to the sugaring dance at Grandma's long ago in the big woods. "Now be good girls, Laura and Mary," was the last thing she said. She was on the wagon seat with Carrie beside her. Their lunch was in the wagon. Pa took up the ox goad. "We'll be back before sundown," he promised.